In 1879, the Arizona Territory had no law requiring a mining company to notify families before closing operations. A man could wake up Tuesday morning with a job in a homestead, and by Wednesday own nothing but the clothes on his back and a signature on a bill of sale he barely understood. It happened to hundreds of families across the Silver Country. It happened to a miner named Joseph Avery, whose 15-year-old daughter stood in a doorway and watched him sign away everything and never forgot. 40 faces. Cleet Pardee had torn down 11 buildings in his life and never once thought twice about any of them. A barn outside Prescott, 2 line shacks near the Gila, a church in Tombstone that had gone to rot after the congregation moved north. Lumber was lumber. You pulled the nails, stacked the boards, loaded the wagon, and collected your pay. A man didn't need philosophy for demolition work. He needed a good pry bar and a strong back. So when Nolan Burrell hired him to salvage timber from an abandoned church at the edge of Copper Vein, Cleet treated it like any other Tuesday. He rode out before dawn with 4 men and 2 empty wagons, frost silvering the sage, October air sharp enough to sting the nostrils. The dying silver town materialized slow through morning haze, collapsed storefronts, a saloon with no door, a livery stable whose roof had caved like a broken promise. Copper Vein had been 1,000 souls 5 years ago. Now it was a graveyard that hadn't finished falling down. The church sat on a low rise at the town's eastern edge, white clapboard against brown hills. Cleet reined up and studied it from horseback, already counting board feet in his head. Good pine siding. Cedar shingles, some replaced recent. By the look of them, straight ridgeline. He squinted. A swept path leading to the front steps. A window patched with oilcloth where glass had cracked. Ain't nobody swept the path to an abandoned building. He swung down and handed his reins to Dooley. Hold here a minute. The front door was heavy oak. Cleet put his shoulder to it and pushed. It swung inward on oiled hinges. Oiled, not rusted, and the smell hit him first. Not rot, not dust. Wood smoke and lye soap and something sweet, like corn mush cooling in a pot. Then the faces, 40 of them, maybe more. Children packed into church pews arranged as sleeping quarters. Blankets shared 3 and 4 to a bed. Small bodies pressed together for warmth. The youngest couldn't have been more than 3. Her thumb in her mouth, her eyes enormous. The oldest, maybe 14, a girl with dark braids who stood up fast when the door opened, positioning herself between Cleet and the smaller ones with her jaw set and her fists closed. At the front of the church, where the pulpit had been, a woman stood with her hands clasped at her waist, mid-30s, thin but straight-spined, brown hair pulled back severe. She wore a patched wool dress and an expression Cleet had only seen once before on a cavalry sergeant who knew the fight was coming and had already decided not to run. She wasn't surprised to see him. "You're Mr. Burrell's men," she said. Not a question. Cleet took off his hat. "Yes, ma'am, we're here to—" He stopped, looked at the children, looked at the massive stone hearth against the back wall, cold and dark as a sealed tomb, looked at the woman again. "Ma'am, I reckon there's been some kind of mistake." "No mistake," she said quietly. "I've been expecting you." Here's what Cleet couldn't have known that morning. That woman had been waiting for a Burrell to walk through that door for 8 years. And she had the kind of patience that only comes from knowing, not hoping, but knowing that debts, like seasons, always come around. Cleet backed out into the cold and sent Dooley riding hard for the Burrell Ranch. The Silver Promise. The year was 1879, and young Nolan Burrell believed his father was the smartest man in the territory. He had reason to think so. Elias Burrell owned more land than any 3 ranchers combined, ran 600 head of cattle on grass so green it looked painted, and conducted business from a mahogany desk hauled by wagon all the way from St. Louis. Men came to Elias with their hats in their hands. They left with less than they'd arrived with and somehow thanked him on the way out. Nolan was 23 that autumn, watching from a leather chair in the corner while his father bought another homestead. The seller was a miner named Avery Rawboned, hollow-eyed, hands still black with ore dust that no amount of scrubbing would lift. He sat across from Elias with the kind of stillness that comes when a man has already lost the negotiation and is only waiting to learn by how much. 60 acres, the cabin, and mineral rights, Elias said, tapping the deed with one manicured finger. "I'll give you $40. The land was worth 10 times that. Even Nolan knew it, though he said nothing. Avery signed. His hand shook, and the pen scratched like something wounded crossing paper. Nolan watched the man's knuckles whiten around the barrel. Movement in the hallway caught his eye. A girl, maybe 15, stood in the doorway with her arms crossed tight against her chest. She wasn't watching her father. She was watching the deed. Her eyes tracked it as Elias folded the paper and slid it into his desk drawer. And her gaze carried something Nolan was too young to name a memory being forged, hot and permanent, in a mind that would not forget. Avery stood. He didn't shake hands. He walked past his daughter without looking at her, and she followed him out, and the front door closed. And that was the end of it. Land is the only thing that lasts. Son, Elias locked the desk drawer and turned the key with a small, satisfied click. People come and go. Dirt stays. Nolan nodded. He was 23, and his father was the smartest man alive. The girl in the doorway was nobody at all. That signature on the deed, remember it. It comes back. The deed and the deadline. Nolan rode into Copper Vein by mid-morning, Cleet's breathless report still ringing in his ears. 40 children, a woman who wouldn't leave, an abandoned building that apparently wasn't abandoned at all. He entered the church alone. The children had been organized since Cleet's visit, pews pushed back, blankets folded, the youngest ones seated in a half-circle around the girl with dark braids, who was reading aloud from a battered primer. The operation had the quiet discipline of a schoolhouse, not a squatter's camp. The woman waited by the cold hearth, same clasped hands, same level gaze. "I'm Nolan Burrell," he said. "I hold the deed to this building. I know who you are." She inclined her head. Cora Avery. The name snagged somewhere in his memory, but didn't catch. He unfolded the deed and held it out. Cora glanced at it the way a person glances at something they've already studied 100 times. "I know exactly what that deed cost," she said. Nolan frowned. "It cost me $18 at the county auction. The building was listed as abandoned. I didn't say what you paid, Mr. Burrell. I said what it cost." He let that pass. "Ma'am, I've got cattle pens to build before winter sets in. I need this timber. You've got no legal claim and no purchase agreement. I'm giving you 2 weeks to find these children alternative placement." Cora didn't flinch. She didn't plead. She stood beside that cold hearth with the patience of bedrock and said, 2 weeks. Nolan studied the fireplace. The stonework was solid, good craftsmanship, built to heat a large room, but the grate held no ash, no char, cold as January iron. "Why don't you light a fire? These children are freezing." "I don't burn what isn't mine," Cora said. A boy, maybe 6, tugged Nolan's coat sleeve. He had a gap where his front teeth should have been, and eyes the color of creek water. "Mister, are you going to take our house?" Nolan looked down at that face, then at the cold hearth, then at Cora Avery, who stood still as stone and twice as certain. He left without answering. What the minds left behind. The minds closed in sequence, like candles blown out one by one down a long hallway. Cora was 22 in 1882, teaching reading and arithmetic to the children of Copper Veins miners. When the first shaft flooded and the company boarded it shut, by spring, 2 more had closed. By summer, the assayer's office stood empty. By autumn, families were loading wagons and heading anywhere: Prescott, Tucson, California, anywhere the ground still yielded something besides grief. The children arrived at her schoolhouse door in 1s and 2s. A boy whose parents left before dawn without waking him. 2 sisters whose father said he'd send for them from Flagstaff and never wrote. A toddler found sitting in the dirt outside the general store, waiting for a mother who had boarded the last stage south. Cora collected them, not by choice, by gravity. When the schoolhouse roof began to leak, she moved them to the church, sturdiest building left standing. Good walls, solid foundation, that massive stone hearth. She organized pews into sleeping quarters, established lessons, rationed what food the departing families left behind. Can I tell you something? Cora never admitted to anyone. She was terrified. Every single night for the first year, after the children slept, she sat in the dark beside that cold hearth and shook until her teeth rattled. She was 22 years old, with 40 mouths to feed, and nobody coming to help. But she stayed. Somebody had to. In the church basement, she found a ledger, leather-bound. Meticulous recording every land transaction conducted through the Copper Vein mining office between 1878 and 1881. She turned pages by candlelight, running her finger down columns of names, dates, and figures, until she found the entry she already knew was there. Avery J. Homestead, 60 acres, sold to E. Burrell, $40. Her father's signature. That same shaking hand, she kept reading, page after page. Burrell, Burrell, Burrell. The same buyer, appearing beside name after name, always paying pennies for what was worth dollars, a pattern so consistent it couldn't be coincidence. Cora closed the ledger. She locked it in the basement cupboard. She climbed the stairs and set another place for supper, because a new child had arrived that morning. Cracks in the certainty. 3 days after the deadline was set, Nolan rode back to check on the packing. Nobody was packing. The church smelled like chalk dust and boiled oats. Children sat in rows on the pew beds, slates balanced on their knees, while Pearl, the girl with dark braids, wrote sums on a makeshift chalkboard. A boy of maybe 8 read aloud from a history primer, his pronunciation careful and proud. In the corner, a 12-year-old girl guided a 6-year-old's fingers through the motions of sewing a button onto a shirt cuff, their heads bent together, patient and precise. Nolan leaned against the door frame with one boot on the threshold, watching, and something shifted in his chest that he didn't have a word for. Cora appeared beside him. "Would you like to see the rest?" She walked him through the building the way a rancher walks a buyer through prize stock, not boasting, just showing what was there. Here, where she'd replaced the siding boards after the storm of '84. There, where she'd sealed the roof with pine pitch and canvas. The foundation she'd repointed with river stone. She hauled herself from the creek bed a quarter-mile south. The cellar, dry and organized, storing what little food remained. His abandoned building had never been abandoned. "You did all this yourself?" he asked. "The older children helped. We learned by doing here." Nolan returned to the hearth, still cold, still dark. 40 children in this building, and not a lick of warmth from the biggest fireplace he'd ever seen. A boy offered him a cup of chicory coffee, thin and bitter, the only hot thing in the room, heated over a cook fire outside because Cora wouldn't burn timber indoors. Nolan drank it, standing by that cold stone, and it tasted like something he couldn't swallow down fast enough. Miss Avery says a man shows who he is by what he does when ain't nobody looking. The boy studied him with steady, ancient eyes. You looking at us, mister? That cup of chicory kept Nolan awake for 3 nights straight. I know, because what he did on the 4th night changed the course of everything. The transactions. In 1885, Cora wrote her 14th letter to the territorial government in Prescott. She described 40 children living in a former church, educated and cared for, requiring official support. She included a detailed accounting of every cent she had spent and every donation she had received. No response came. None ever had. She wrote to churches in Tucson, Phoenix, Santa Fe. For a time, small donations arrived, $10 here, $5 there, a crate of blankets from a Baptist congregation in Flagstaff. Then the letters stopped coming, and the money dried up like a creek in August. Cora survived on stubbornness and arithmetic. She calculated how many meals each sack of flour would yield. She taught the older children to trap rabbits and gather wild onion. She mended every garment until the patches wore through, and she patched the patches and started again. And in the quiet hours, when the children slept, she studied the ledger. What she found took months to piece together. The dates told the story not all at once, but line by line, entry by entry, the way a trail of blood tells you which direction the wounded animal went. Elias Burrell's land purchases didn't simply follow the mine closures. They preceded them. Each time Burrell bought a cluster of homesteads at rock-bottom prices, the corresponding mine shaft closed within weeks, not months. Weeks. He hadn't been opportunistic. He'd been orchestrated. Elias Burrell had pressured the mining company to accelerate closures, reducing operations shaft by shaft, triggering the exodus so land prices would collapse and he could buy systematically. The Burrell Ranch, 1,200 acres of green grass and fat cattle, sat on ground taken from families like hers, not stolen with a pistol, stolen with paper and patience and signatures wrung from desperate hands. Cora locked the ledger away. She did not seek a lawyer. She did not write to a newspaper. She kept teaching. She kept feeding. She kept the count. When word reached Coppervein that Elias Burrell had died in 1886, Cora set another place at the table. A new child had come that morning. They always did, she said to herself, closing the ledger for what she believed was the last time. Somebody's son will come for this building, and when he does, I'll be ready. The 4th night, Nolan couldn't sleep. 3 nights he'd lain in his own bed on his own ranch, staring at his own ceiling, seeing 40 faces and a cold hearth. The deed sat on his desk where he'd left it, weighted by a stone paperweight his father had given him. He couldn't look at the document without hearing Cora's voice. "I didn't say what you paid. I said what it cost." On the 4th night, he saddled his horse at midnight and rode to Coppervein, under a sky so thick with stars it looked like somebody had spilled flour across black cloth. The church was dark, except for a single candle in the window nearest the hearth. He pushed the door open quietly. Children slept in their pew beds, breathing soft and even, bundled tight against the October cold. Cora sat on the stone floor beside the hearth with a stack of slates, marking lessons by candlelight. Shadows moved across her face each time the flame bent in the draft. She looked up, but didn't startle. "I wondered when you'd come back. I ain't here to argue about the deadline." He turned his hat in his hands, then set it on a pew. "I'm here because I can't figure why a woman with no money, no claim, and no help stays 8 years in a building that don't belong to her, raising children that ain't her own." Cora set down the slate. "Sit." He sat on the stone hearth, and the cold of it seeped through his trousers like winter had taken up permanent residence in the rock. Cora spoke quietly, careful not to wake the children. "My father was a miner named Joseph Avery. He signed his homestead over to a man named Elias Burrell in 1879 for $40. I was 15. I watched him sign." Nolan's stomach turned. The name, the memory, the gaunt man, the shaking hand, the girl in the doorway with her arms crossed. "That girl. I remember," he whispered. Cora stood. "Come with me." She led him to the basement stairs, down into the cool dark, to a cupboard she unlocked with a key she wore around her neck. She placed the ledger on a wooden table and opened it beneath the candle. "Your father's handwriting," she said. Nolan touched the page. He knew that script better than his own. It had signed his birthday greetings, his school permissions, the letter congratulating him on his first profitable cattle drive. Now it marched down columns of transactions, names, dates, amounts, each entry a family unmade. Cora turned pages, showed him the dates. Mine closures aligned with purchases like teeth in a gear, coordinated, systematic, deliberate. His hand trembled against the paper. He pulled it away and pressed his knuckles against the table edge until the wood bit into his skin. "I didn't stay for the building. Nolan." Her voice was steady as the stone above them. "I stayed because someone had to be here when the truth came home." The candle guttered. Nolan stared at his father's handwriting until the letters swam. "Can I tell you something?" Nolan never said aloud to another living soul. He sat in that basement for 2 hours after Cora went upstairs. He read every page, and when he came out, the man who climbed those stairs was not the same man who had walked down them. The reckoning. Elias Burrell's voice came to Nolan one last time. It was the memory of his father's deathbed in 1886, the old man's grip still fierce, pressing the church deed into Nolan's palm, his breath rattling like wind through a broken shutter. Tear it down. Use the timber. Don't look back. Nolan looked back. The Copper Vein Town Council met in what had been the assayer's office, the only public building left, with 4 walls and a roof besides the church. 7 men sat around a scarred table. Nolan stood at one end holding the deed in his right hand and the ledger in his left. Cora stood at the back of the room, arms folded, saying nothing. "Gentlemen," Nolan said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "I called this meeting because I've come into possession of information regarding my father's land dealings in this district." He opened the ledger and read 3 entries aloud. Names the men recognized: neighbors, former friends, families that had vanished into wagons headed west. Beside each name, the date of sale, the amount paid, and the corresponding date the nearest mine shaft closed. The gap between events, never more than 2 weeks. The room went still. A chair leg scraped against the plank floor. Someone coughed once, and then thought better of making any sound at all. The silence pressed against the walls like something physical. My father didn't just buy from desperate men. Nolan's throat tightened. He swallowed once, set his hand flat on the table to steady himself, and kept going. He made him desperate. Then he bought. He laid the deed on the table. This church is the last piece of property my father took from this town. There's a woman inside it who's been raising the children your families left behind for 8 years, without pay, without help, without a single soul in this territory given a tinker's damn whether those young ones lived or froze. Old Tom Hadley, who ran the remaining general store, leaned forward in his chair, his mouth opened and closed without producing a word. "I'm signing this deed over to Cora Avery," Nolan said. "The church becomes a permanent school and children's home. I'll fund repairs and provisions through the winter from my own accounts. My cattle pens will be built from new timber, cut on my own land, at my own expense." Hadley found his voice. "That's a considerable thing you're doing." "Nolan." "No, sir." Nolan's jaw set. "It's a considerable thing that should have been done the day my father signed his first bill of sale in this town." He looked across the room at Cora. She didn't smile. She didn't weep. She stood with her hands clasped at her waist, the same posture she'd held the morning Cleet pushed open the church door, the same posture she'd held for 8 years of waiting, and she nodded. Once, that was enough. The hearth. 3 weeks later, the first snow came to Copper Vein. It fell quiet and steady through the morning, covering the collapsed storefronts and empty streets in white, softening every hard edge, turning the dying town into something that looked for a few hours at least, like a place worth believing in. Again, Nolan rode in carrying an armload of split oak across his saddle. Not pine salvaged from somebody else's walls. Not timber torn from a building that 40 children called home. Oak, cut and seasoned on Burrell land, hauled 6 miles through fresh snow by a man who could have sent any one of his 12 hands to do it, but chose to come himself. Cora stood in the church doorway. She watched him dismount, pull the wood from the saddle, and carry it inside without a word. The children parted for him. He walked through their silence toward the great stone hearth, that massive fireplace that had stood cold and dark since the day Cora moved in, because she would not burn timber in a building that wasn't hers. It was hers now. Nolan knelt on the hearthstone. He stacked the oak the way his father had taught him, and the thought of Elias Burrell's hands doing this same work in this same territory settled over him like a weight he would carry the rest of his life, not with bitterness, but with the steady resolve of a man who has chosen to build where his father chose to take. Kindling first, then heartwood, then the heavy logs that would burn slow and steady through the night. He struck a match on the hearthstone. The sulfur flared bright in the dim church. He touched it to the kindling, and the flame caught, and it climbed, and it spread. And for the first time in 8 years, that hearth breathed heat into the room. 40 children gathered around it. Some held their hands toward the warmth, fingers spread wide, as if the fire were something they could hold. The youngest pressed close with her thumb in her mouth, her eyes reflecting the light. Pearl, the girl with dark braids who had stood guard that first morning, sank to her knees beside the smallest ones, and the tears that ran down her face caught the firelight and turned to gold. Cora stood beside Nolan. Neither spoke. The fire crackled and settled into its work. Heat rose against the old stone and pushed outward into the room, reaching the pew beds, reaching the patched walls, reaching the corners where cold had lived unchallenged for years. The church windows began to glow. Outside, on the road, Cleet Pardee pulled his horse to a stop. He'd been riding past on his way to the Burrell Ranch fences to mend. There were always fences to mend when the light caught his eye. Golden light, pouring from every pane of that old white church on the rise. And behind the glass, 40 faces watching the first snow fall. The same faces that had stared back at him from darkness 7 weeks ago, when he'd pushed open that oak door expecting lumber and found something else entirely. Cleet tipped his hat to nobody in particular, held it there a moment against the falling snow. Then he settled it back on his head and rode on, carrying the image with him down the long road home. Some debts can't be paid with money. Some can only be paid by kneeling down on cold stone, striking a match, and warming a house you once came to destroy. The fire steadied, the snow fell, the hearth held